Welcome back to the Warehouse Podcast, everyone. My name's Elijah. You all know why you're here. I know why you're here. If you're not here for the trade deadline or you don't know why you're here, we still want you here. That's really great. I'm glad you are so willing to listen to a podcast without any real motivation. But we are here to talk about the trade deadline. Orioles made a flurry of moves, seemingly all in the span of about 12 seconds. I'm going to thank our sponsor real quick so we can get into it and keep doing it uninterrupted. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform, your number one source for everything online sports betting. Right now, you can receive a 50% free bet of up to $250 on your first deposit to bet on anything from the Olympics to baseball to F1 racing. Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head on over to the online casino, get in on a game of blackjack or poker, or unwind with one of over 150 slots games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Use promo code BLEAV, that's BLEAV, for your 50% free bet credit on your first deposit of up to $250. Bet Online, the game starts here. All right, so we're coming into this trade deadline, and the Orioles have already made a couple moves. Obviously, we've talked about those over the last couple episodes. We acquired Zach Eflin, Seranthony Dominguez, Christian Pache, have done a little bit to shore up the bullpen, have done a little bit to go ahead and shore up the rotation. Some good outfield defense, can't complain with that too much. So with that backdrop against it, earlier today, the Miami Marlins traded 26-year-old left-handed pitcher Trevor Rogers to us in return for second baseman Connor Norby and listed as center fielder, but we all know he doesn't really play center field, outfielder Kyle Stowers. The initial reaction to this, I was not a fan of it. If you've been with us for a while, I did an off-season series specifically looking at the Marlins rotation, options that they had in terms of potentially being a trade partner with us. I tried to dive into all of their starting pitchers from Alcantara to, Edward Cabrera, Trevor Rogers, Braxton Garrett, all the way through. And I spent, a good while talking about Rogers. I spent some time researching him. The short of it is, this is a guy who was a borderline rookie of the year in 2021. Really phenomenal stuff. He has struggled with injuries ever since. The stuff has declined. He has consistently just struggled ever since, and has seemingly done so more and more as time has gone on. This year has been, close to his worst year in a number of metrics. So, but that said, just to talk about him a little bit, he is only 26 years old again. It's a very east to west mix. Both fastballs ride arm side. He throws a four seam and a sinker. His average changeup has near 0 inches of vertical break. And it's, again, like heavy arm side run. He has a bit more of a gyro slider, but, so everything is very east to west, and it's a lot about pitchability. It's a lot about command. That's just who he is. And so, to kind of illustrate, how he has changed over time, the first thing I saw was, and I pointed this out in the offseason series, but it's taken an even more dramatic turn since. His velocity is down. He was averaging 94.5 in that 2021 rookie campaign. He was down to about 93 last year, and he's down another full mile an hour to 91.8 on his average fastball this year. That is concerning. A guy who has struggled with injuries. You don't know if he's totally healthy, and there's obviously always some manner of, lost time to be conditioning, to be strengthening yourself as a result of those injuries. But we can't really say whether he's still dealing with something and that's never going to get better, or whether he is, potentially on the mend, potentially whatever. I can say in looking through the last couple months, there has been no uptick in velocity for him. So we'll see. But that said, we've got 2 years of control over him after this, and that is something that is an important part of this trade, of course. He is very cheap this year at just about $1.5 million. So I think, all in all, you're acquiring something that's a little bit of a project. But, for where he stands right now, he's got really no put away stuff. He strikes out this like paltry 18% of people. He also walks almost 10. Both of those are easily bottom third of the MLB. I talked about him being somebody who is a pitchability guy. He really needs to rely on the command because he does not have that put away stuff. No pitch he has a 30% whiff rate. He relies on contact, and he induces ground balls at a really strong rate. It's been near 50% or over just about every year he's been in the bigs. But he has to rely on that command, and he has to nibble to an extent, and that, like, because he has not been effective in the zone this year, that has led him to walking almost 10% of guys, striking out none, low chase rates, low whiff rates, all the above. So I mentioned that he walks a bunch of guys. To just kind of add to that, his whip is over 1.5 right now. Rogers is just under the qualified threshold, but if you back that qualified area from like 105 to 106 innings right now, I'm not quite sure which it is, but of pitchers with 100 innings this year, his 1.53 whip would be the worst in Major League Baseball. He is, as I said, walking a ton of guys. He is giving up contact. It's pretty loud contact a lot of the time. And, this whip over 1.5 was the same red flag that I had when we acquired Jack Flaherty last year. He's just, Flaherty is a measure of erratic that I don't think Trevor Rogers really is. And I shouldn't say Jack Flaherty is. Jack Flaherty, the version last year, was erratic in a way that Trevor Rogers isn't really. Rogers just has to nibble. That's he does not have the stuff to compete with somebody in the zone. And so he is kind of forced into this situation where he's going to end up walking a lot of guys because he's living around the corners. And we gave up Norby and Stowers, which I think were two of the larger trade chips that the Orioles were comfortable moving. We've obviously been talking about these guys for years at this point as potential options to be traded because they do not really have a future with us. And so, we had this pretty, seemingly tantalizing. I know we overvalue because we're Baltimore fans and everything. But this seemingly somewhat valuable package, I think that the Marlins in this are getting, I think Kyle Stowers steps in pretty much every day in a corner outfield for them right now. I think that Connor Norby is at least a platoon bat for them. And because the Marlins are not good, we'll put it bluntly, because the Marlins are not good, he's got a chance to play near every day for them as well, 5 games a week, etc. So they're getting a lot of value. They have 6 years of control over both of those guys, and they are just about everyday players. And even if you're not a good player, when you're getting paid the major league minimum, you're providing a lot of surplus value to that team. So I will caveat my frustration that there were worse deals for starting pitchers in this market. The Yusei Kikuchi thing was kind of obscene. We probably paid less for Trevor Rogers than the Astros did for 2 months of a Yusei Kikuchi, which was pretty bananas for a guy who, is running a near 5 ERA and walks a ton of guys. I digress. But that's all to say that the market, is a seller's market. I think this is just kind of the new norm for us as fans of a sport where they have expanded the playoffs and pretty much every team in the National League is in the race right now. A lot of teams in the American League too, of course. So the couple teams who are willing to commit to being sellers are going to make out like bandits. That's the reason that the Rays were willing to just sell off everything. That's the reason we got Zach Eflin. It's really just the system as it is currently configured is set up for sellers, and that's fine. Their MLB is trying to incentivize competition. They want the playoffs to be this larger fiasco with more teams, more fans interested. They make more money. I understand that. Man, I've gotten off track. So let's get back to this trade here. So, why did the Orioles make this trade knowing we were paying this large cost for a guy who is somewhat of a question mark? I think the first thing to say, and that we all need to acknowledge, is that Norby and Stowers, despite what our valuation of them is, Norby is a second base prospect only. They have been putting him in the corner outfield in Norfolk. He definitely could not play left field at Camden Yards. There are a lot of other stadiums in MLB where nobody would feel comfortable with him playing left field. He is, as such, he is very limited. He does not have good tools in really any way. He just is a smart hitter who knows how to maximize what he's got. He elevates and he elevates to the pull side. And so, like, credit to him for doing what he can, but he is limited. There is a limit to what he could potentially be. He's not going to be Dan Uggla hitting 40 home runs out of the second base slot. That's not it. So potential for him to be a 260 hitter who can maybe top 20 home runs in his best season, and play a pretty mediocre second base. So, there's a place for that in MLB, not to like devalue him, but we just have to put in context that because he does have this pretty limited ceiling, that limits his value. Kyle Stowers, I think probably has a higher ceiling if he can cut down on the strikeouts a little bit. He will play a good corner outfield. He's got a good arm out there, and he's got the power. And I did a thing on him during spring training as well, because as he was going off, he hits barrels. He also, like, quality of contact is through the roof with him, but he also has the raw power to back it up. If you can cut down on the Ks, he's got a little bit of a higher ceiling, but that is a huge if. He's, also a 26-year-old prospect, I think. And so the development time for him is coming down quickly. So that's important to note in this. And, given the cost of starting pitchers on the market, we ended up with a guy, again, who is only 26 years old, has shown this super, super high promise in the past, and has 2 more years of control after this. And then on top of that, in his last 11 starts, he's allowed more than 2 earned runs only twice. That follows a little bit of a trend through June and July where the quality of contact against him has gone down a bit. Expected batting average, slugging, and WOBA against him are all down on every pitch besides his changeup. The changeup really is his most effective pitch. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's been his least effective pitch, but his, like, metrically and stuff-wise, his best pitch. So I'm sure the Orioles think maybe with some, pitch usage tweaks, with some kind of adjustments there, they can maximize the potential of that changeup a little bit. It was a huge, huge weapon back in his best year. So interesting to see what the Orioles do with that. If we potentially can, find a way to get hitters off of it to an extent, because clearly they're somewhat sitting on it at this point. They're saying, I'm not going to let the changeup beat me. But that said, expected batting average, expected slugging, expected WOBA, down on every other pitch through June and July relative to the beginning of the year. The swing and miss on his slider went up 20% in July. The Ks haven't really followed it, but another pitch that, seemingly is making some strides. And then I mentioned it earlier, but through, all of his career, he's posted consistently strong ground ball rates. And yeah, I guess in the end, this is a guy who there are certain reasons to be more optimistic. He is young, he is cheap, he has had injuries that can help explain the performance problems, and he bumps Albert Suarez to the pen where Suarez is more effective. He is a lefty, which we've been talking about in Camden Yards. Lefties can get beat up a little bit, and Colton Cowser will run around and do his thing out there. We saw him supporting Zach Eflin the other day in left field. I'm not going to say that I'm thrilled with it, but in terms of the value lost for the Orioles, I think we are still very much in a position where Connor Norby does not factor into whether this team wins the World Series. Kyle Stowers does not factor into whether this team wins the World Series. And Trevor Rogers factors into, like, how healthy we are going into the postseason, what postseason slot we get. I think that's all pretty valid. And, maybe there is a situation in which he can become Keegan Aiken in the bullpen for the playoff stretch. And, his fastball does bump back up to 94, and we can utilize him a little bit in a playoff situation. I'm not counting on that, but there is a path to that. And then heading into 2025, you have a full offseason to work with him to make sure he is healthy and to hopefully recoup some of the stuff that made him so unbelievably good in that first year. So that was earlier in the day. And then seemingly all at once, right as the deadline was approaching, the Orioles, like there was sporadic news all over the place. We're trying to like connect puzzle pieces. It was kind of a nightmare as a fan. It's exactly like the chaos of the deadline that you love. But so kind of the biggest trade out of that little flurry of moves at the last moment, the Phillies traded us Gregory Soto for right-handed pitcher Seth Johnson and right-handed pitcher Moises Chase. Kylie McDaniel, at like 5:50, ominously tweeted that Seth Johnson was on his way to Philly. McDaniel obviously is a prospect focus guy, so it's kind of amusing that he got that information first and did not know anything else. But that said, Gregory Soto, he was an all-star for the Tigers a couple years ago. You could argue that he was an all-star for the Tigers because the Tigers needed to have an all-star, and I would agree with you. But that said, he has a huge arm. From the left side, it is 98 miles an hour. I think 97.7 was the average. He's a sinker slider guy. He's got more of a bullet and a sweeper. And I saw on StatCast there's a cutter that he's barely thrown. He's thrown it 7 times. I hadn't really seen that. But when you're over there in a pen with Jose Alvarado and he's throwing these 92, 93 mile an hour sinkers, maybe you want to try something out and pick it up a little bit. But he has this huge arm. He strikes out like 27% of the batters he faces, but this is another guy who just issues a ton of walks. I told you Rogers was walking under 10% as a starting pitcher. That's very concerning. Soto walks 12%. Because of the strikeouts, obviously, you can live with that to a higher extent with a relief pitcher. That's what they do. But it is somewhat amusing, like between Kimbrel, Sir Anthony Dominguez, and Gregory Soto, we are just reassembling this Phillies bullpen that absolutely collapsed in the playoffs last year. I am not a believer that what happened in the playoffs last year is doomed to repeat itself. I don't think that's true at all. And I think that the concept of playoff performance is somewhat overblown, except in the cases of like CC Sabathia and Madison Bumgarner. I don't think that playoff performance is too much of a thing. It's just that it's such a small sample size and obviously the pressure is on, so things get overblown a little bit, and that's fine. Obviously all eyes are on you, but those guys had those outings during the regular season too. They also had good outings in the regular season. They also had good outings in the playoffs. Everything is a narrative, I guess is all I'm saying. But it is amusing at face value that we are like reconstructing this bullpen that seemed to implode altogether at once. But all of these guys are really high octane stuff. We have talked about on this podcast. I'm sure every other respectable Orioles podcast has talked about this pen needing more strikeouts. And a lot of times when you seek strikeouts, you get walks with it. That's just how it works. If you do not have walks with it, then you have like Emmanuel Clase, and he's not available for a reason. Bullpen arms, if you want to chase that high octane stuff, you lose control of it. You are moving your arm faster. It is harder to dial in where it's going. That's a very just simple, straightforward thing. And so we're chasing that high octane stuff. We're chasing Ks, and we're getting them. Sir Anthony Dominguez, Craig Kimbrel, and Gregory Soto here are all guys who can strike out nearly 30% of the batters they face. And that's what this pen sorely needed. If we need to induce a ground ball double play, we'll go to Cionel Perez or Yenier Cano. We have the guys who can get ground balls. We have the guys who pitch to contact. We needed strikeouts, and we went and got it. So as to the return, Seth Johnson and Moises Chase. Johnson, I think, was the first look at some potential like 40-man roster cleanup in anticipation of this upcoming Rule 5 draft this year. He was acquired in the Trey Mancini deal, so salute to Trey Mancini for looking out for Birdland after all this time. We still love him. Good to know he loves us. Johnson is really a good arm. It's like he was a good fastball, big breaking ball kind of guy. He is a little bit older due to the Tommy John surgery, and so likely this year was going to be about him, getting the experience he's getting now in AA, and then somewhat rushing him to AAA toward the end of the year to like push the envelope and see what we got in him. And rather than, this condensed timeline and trying to figure out what to do with him and this crunch, we flip him into this pretty solid bullpen arm. Soto will be around next year as well at relatively good rates. So you have to be pretty happy with that. Moises Chase had actually come up in my mind as somebody who could kind of be interesting as a potential trade target, given the relative strength of some of our starting pitching depth down at that level. On the Verge last night, I was on there. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate those guys for having me. I mentioned him or Edgar Portes as a deal involving Taylor Rogers of the Giants. I had the wrong reliever, but I am claiming a W there for calling out a high A pitching prospect as somebody who could potentially be on the move. So I'm going to take a win there, and I'm just tooting my own horn here for no reason whatsoever. But on a serious note, Chase, he was our number 24 prospect for Fangraphs, per Fangraphs. He's really been having a great year. ERA in the low threes. He's got 76 Ks and 52 innings pitched. Wishing him all the best. This is just a situation, we have, like I said, some depth down there. Edgar Portes, Michael Foret, also at the same level, also pitching well. So we are, dealing a low A prospect and a guy that we weren't sure we were going to be able to keep him in the Rule 5 draft this year. And we're getting back a, big time high octane arm for this year and next. So really can't be too upset about that. Gregory, Soto, we're excited to have him. This next one blew my mind. I saw it and I was at work. So I'm going to give a little context here. My team, I work and live in Florida. My team is based in LA, and my boss flew out to be based in my office, around my current setup for this week. And so like it was just the worst week to have the trade deadline, because I'm obviously just wanting to scroll Twitter and just, like be looking at all this stuff and understanding what's happening and talking in the On the Verge Discord and on Twitter and doing all this stuff. And, at like 5:50 something or whatever, it comes through that the Orioles are acquiring Eloy Jimenez from the Chicago White Sox. And I mean, when I tell you that my brain shut down, it just like did not compute. I short circuited and it just like dropped. I was like, I cannot possibly understand what is happening right now. I'm not even sure we have a prospect who is of low enough value to send for Eloy Jimenez straight up. The Orioles found one. I don't know. I'm not a fan. I see the intent, but this must have come together at the last second, because we must have been looking for something better. The one thing I will say about it is Eloy is on a substantial salary this year. I think he's making $13.5 million, if I remember correctly. And this is a straight salary dump for the Chicago White Sox. And the Orioles being on the receiving end of a straight salary dump is a wild concept. And it really, this coupled with, Sir Anthony Dominguez having an $8 million option next year, Gregory, Soto being under control for next year, and especially Zach Eflin and his $18 million contract next year, this very, very much signals a changing of the times. The purse strings have been opened up a bit. Obviously, it's like not the Gunnar extension that we want, but it is very, very significant to have this kind of financial investment in the team. And, like we just picked up, I think like $6 million of a right-handed hitting platoon DH contract. We said, okay, we will take $6 million to just spend on a guy who's going to hit in like 2-3 games every week. pretty astounding. Just really not something that you would ever expect the Orioles to do. It's great. So Trey McGow, man, I'm tripping. It's like 3 a.m. right now. I fell asleep on the couch because it was a long, stressful day of scrolling Twitter and hiding it from my boss. And I'm recording this stupid late. So just bear with me. But Trey McGough, I think it's McGough. Man, I haven't heard his name enough. Anyway, G-O-U-G-H, M-C-G-O-U-G-H. Relief prospect. He's really done quite well this year. This is somebody that we, like a lot of people have talked about, could potentially be up at the end of the year. But, he is a 26-year-old relief prospect in this economy that is next to nothing. And he was also Rule 5 eligible this year. So very, very large chance he was not going to stick with us unless he was coming up to the major league pen. Obviously, we had our sights set on acquiring relievers. We did that. We got Sir Anthony Dominguez. We got Gregory Soto. And Trey McGough was largely not valuable at that point. Yeah, so I don't see how Eloy helps this roster entirely, though. He is a right-handed hitting DH only. Like I was talking about, you cannot trust Connor Norby in left field at Camden Yards. You cannot trust Eloy Jimenez like anywhere on a field besides like the batter's box. Honestly, once he hits the ball and leaves the batter's box, you can't trust him there either. He's slow. He like base running is no value. Anywhere fielding is no value. We are bringing him in to hit the ball against a left-handed pitcher, and that's it. That's literally it. And, we needed a person to do that. And, if there's a situation where we're facing a left-handed starter, Mountcastle takes first base, Adley's behind the dish, and Eloy Jimenez is our DH. It's not the worst thing. He's an above average hitter against lefties. He's got like a 360 on base percentage against lefties. It's all fine. I'm fine with that. If you're watching on YouTube and you just saw me jump again, it's the same thing as the last video. I don't know why I don't plug my computer in before I do these. I apologize. We're back at it. So, Eloy is going to fill this role. And the fact that the Orioles are willing to take on a bad contract in order to fill this role is pretty promising, just in terms of our hopes for free agency, our hopes for looking forward, and the economic support that the front office is going to have. But, in terms of him strictly, like I said, he is slightly better than league average against lefties. And, really he posts excellent exit velocities, excellent hard hit rates. He smashes the ball. The problem is he smashes it into the ground. His exit velocities, hard hit rates are both top 10% in MLB. The launch angle sweet spot rates, how often he gets into that 15, 25 degree range, those are bottom 5%. He just pounds the ball into the ground. He actually has the highest ground ball rate of any hitter in MLB besides Tim Beckham, who is not currently on a team. So if you can find a way to have him elevate the ball, he returns to potentially not fully the rookie of the year level where he was, smashing 30 home runs or whatever, but potentially you could have something somewhat valuable there. And as a left-handed hitter, as a left-handed pitching, as an answer to left-handed pitching, you can somewhat hope that he will turn into a useful piece, and once again, we gave up absolutely nothing for him. I assume that this was not the Orioles' first choice. They were going ahead and looking for something higher, I would like to think. But after Tommy Pham, we really did not see a ton of outfielder, right-handed hitting position players moved. So I think that's an interesting, I think this was an interesting backup plan. It was creative, and it does get us a right-handed bat. It does not get us somebody who we would be okay with in the outfield, like an Austin Hayes was. But theoretically, he can fit into the lineup, and you won't have too many problems. The next trade here, we got Austin Slater and Livan Soto, left fielder and shortstop, and cash to the Baltimore Orioles for a player to be named later or cash. So they traded us cash, and we might trade cash back, which is kind of interesting. But there's not too much to say about this. The Orioles clearly have a thing for Livan Soto. We claimed and lost him twice in the offseason, which is just kind of a funny thing. Slater is the one who's had some MLB experience. You probably recognize his name from the San Francisco Giants. He's an above average speed outfielder. In his career, he has really hit lefties well. This year, I don't know, he's oddly better against righties in a super small sample, but he has still mostly been deployed against lefties. But, he plays solid defense. He's more suited to corner outfield rather than center. He's been playing in center, but metrics don't love him quite as much over there. He walks a ton. He lifts the ball pretty well, but, I will caution, this is a dude who is hitting 185 on the year. So don't get super excited. And once again, we traded a player to be named later or cash. So we did not give up anything of value here. And we didn't really get anything of value in return. Livan Soto is going to be a depth infielder who will be lovely to have at AAA in the case of an injury. But if either of these guys spend significant time on the team, something has probably gone wrong. The last trade of the day, and I do think this is a pretty interesting one. This is kind of fun to me to look at, like, the evolution of the front office and how they're going to transition from building prospect depth to maintaining prospect depth, and how they are building, or how they're transitioning from building a good team to maintaining a good team. Something that I have referenced, I think, on this podcast, and certainly in texting people, is over the offseason, the Los Angeles Dodgers made a trade. It was Michael Busch to the Cubs for Jackson Ferris. Jackson Ferris is a high octane, super young high school prospect arm that they got from the Cubs. And Michael Busch was really just he didn't fully have a spot on the current roster for the Dodgers. He was going to get kicked off the 40-man, but he was too talented of a prospect to just set to the wind, in the Rule 5 draft. So the Orioles did kind of a similar thing here, and it makes me really happy. It is not at the same level. Busch is obviously he's got an over 800 OPS for the Cubs. Jackson Ferris, again, really, really talented arm. That was not the level that this was happening at. But Billy Cook, our utility infield outfielder for Norfolk, who's really been having a strong season, is another guy who was going to be Rule 5 eligible. We were going to have to make a decision on him, and he probably did not have a path to the major league team, to staying on the 40-man roster for us. And so we flipped him to the Pirates for this young, A-ball right-handed pitcher named Patrick Riley. If you have a really, really good memory, Patrick Riley was actually in the spring breakout game against us, where we saw Paul Skeens, Jackson Holliday, Tamar Johnson, Pasayo, that fun series that MLB put on to showcase prospects. Patrick Riley actually threw against us in that. He has a pretty big time fastball, can get up into the upper 90s. He has a cutter and a slider that flash plus, but are kind of inconsistent. And then a pretty meh changeup. But, potentially with some work on his command, he could be a somewhat legitimate arm, potentially, capable of starting in the bigs. The Pirates have low-key, been churning out some pitchers. So, getting somebody who is receiving good reviews out of their system as an arm, clearly they valued Cook a little bit. I think it makes sense for them. Pittsburgh is hurting for any kind of offensive output. Having a guy who they can slot into multiple positions, who, he's shown a little bit of pop, 800 plus OPS at AAA. Billy Cook is, for all intents and purposes, a useful utility depth guy to have. And so I think this trade really works out for both teams. And for the Orioles, what it does is it takes some of the upper level position depth that you have, and it pushes it back and starts kind of filling, maybe not a need. I just talked about how good our starting pitching was in high A, but pushes it back to kind of just like start preparing the next wave that you're eventually going to need after the next 2-3 years are done. So, creative move. I think I really loved how it worked. And I think beneficial for both sides. Kudos to Elias for, I almost said Elijah. Kudos to me, kudos to Elias and the Orioles front office for kind of thinking creatively there. And I think that kind of move, it bodes well for us maintaining an eye on the future. But obviously we're not like, we traded away a bunch of prospects and some legitimate talent in Baumeister and all this stuff that we've talked about. So we are not sacrificing the present to maintain the future, but we are keeping an eye on it. And I think that can only bode well for us. So this has been the quick hitter trade deadline recap. I think I'm going to try to convince some of my other hosts to come on and talk to me about trades. I feel like, I don't know, I guess I've done 3 podcasts in the last like 36 hours about the trade deadline. The last one I gave you guys, then On the Verge that night on Monday, and then this one on Tuesday night. But I'm sick for it. I'm crazy. So we're going to get some of the other guys on, of course, and we're all going to come together and talk about this sometime soon. Get a little vibe check. We haven't talked, actually, we've talked plenty, but we haven't talked on the podcast throughout the season. It is so much easier for one of us to come on and do this. So we'll all come together, see how we're feeling heading into the home stretch. And we'll check in with you guys soon. As always, want to thank you for listening. If you would be so gracious, if you like what we're giving you, please do subscribe to us, follow, and leave us ratings, like, heart, favorite, whatever, on your preferred platform. We would be so grateful. Once again, it helps us reach new followers, new listeners, and that's something we always appreciate. We appreciate engaging with you guys. So definitely, feel free to reach out to us. I think we're most active on Twitter /X. At the Warehouse Pod. You can email us, thewarehousepod@gmail.com. And I think the Orioles are set up in a good place heading into this postseason run. I'm excited to see it. I think it's going to be a good year for us. Excited to see and partially scared to see how these bullpen moves work out. We added a lot of juice to the pen. I think the average fastball in the pen probably went up like 3-4 miles an hour, but you're going to be a lot of base runners. So we're going to have a lot of walks. So we'll see how all that goes. We'll keep an eye on it, and we will talk about it on the next Warehouse podcast. Thanks for listening. My name's Elijah. Go O's.